And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time talking about a novel about World War II and how appropriate. Last week was the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and we talked about that significance. Last week was also the anniversary of the Battle of Midway, while we're talking about airplanes. That'd be the 77th anniversary, so we certainly have talked about that. This is going to be an hour where we're also dedicating it to those of you that are veterans, whether you served in World War II or in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Desert Storm, whatever it might be. That is another theme that comes out of this new book called Mustang, written by our good friend John J. Dwyer. Has been in studio with us before. It is a novel of World War II, and if you will, sort of a little bit of a follow-up to his other wonderful historical fiction about Shortgrass. So we'll get into that as well. John is a good friend of this ministry, as the author of about 8 books, 3-time winner of the Fort Worth-based National Will Rogers Medallion Award. You might remember the last time we had him in talking about this excellent historical narrative on the Oklahomans, and we'll get into that. You, if you are a Civil War buff, might remember some of his books like Stonewall and Robert E. Lee and others. And this one is a little bit different in that more recently he's been writing about World War II, and that fits very well because he's also an adjunct professor of history and ethics at Southern Nazarene University in Oklahoma City, SNU. I might just mention he's also a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, as well as Dallas Theological Seminary, and joins me now in studio. So, John, just been great to have you around here all these years.
We kind of have been around each other for a few years now, haven't we, brother?
You've gone up to Oklahoma, so I don't get to see you as often, but for just a minute, I might mention the connection you and I had. One of the strongest connections was we produced, and you produced, a Christian newspaper, which I really encourage some of our other listeners to do as well. It was called the Dallas-Fort Worth Heritage, one of the largest Christian newspapers in the country. And I've always said that if you don't like what the newspapers are printing, create your own, and you did.
Well, I did, but with the help of a lot of folks like yourself. I'll never forget, Kerby, when we first started bouncing this idea around in the late 80s, I think, you said, it's amazing. Waco has a Christian newspaper, and Dallas doesn't.
Yes.
So that was kind of the catapult forward.
Well, and one of the other people we mentioned off air was Reg Grant, who has been so instrumental. 4 of my last 5 producers of this program have come from the media arts program at Dallas Seminary. So you and I owe a debt of gratitude to Reg Grant at Dallas Seminary too, don't we?
Well, Reg Grant's kind of my writing mentor. If he's out there listening, he knows there were a couple of times early on when I was about ready to quit writing, and he encouraged me and said, hey, if you quit writing, you're going to deprive a lot of folks in the Christian community of a blessing. How do you quit with that kind of, conviction?
One of the other people on your board is somebody who was with us last time, Bill Murkison, and columnist for the Dallas Morning News all those years. You used to actually be in the sports department, if I remember right, in the Dallas Times-Herald, which was the now defunct newspaper. So you bring a journalist background, a writing background, and as we get into July, we always emphasize this Christian Writers Conference. And you, even in Oklahoma, have benefited from being around other fellow writers. It's been a way to hone your craft, and for you now as an accomplished writer to hone the craft of other future writers, hasn't it?
Yes, Kerby, and whenever I'm asked, which I often am by wannabe writers, what do I need to do to be a writer? What do I need to do to get a book published? My first and foremost piece of advice is join, belong to, be regular in, and get involved in a local writers group. No matter how many books I ever have published, how many awards, I'm always going to be a faithful attender of my writers group because, fundamentals, ideas, networking. So those of you out there that are trying to get something written and published, ask yourself, am I in a local writers group and am I participating and contributing? If you're not, that needs to be your next step toward getting your book published.
I oftentimes said it's a pronoun problem. It is, what do I need to do? No, what do we need to do? Because you actually can benefit a great deal by back and forth. And this particular novel, as well as most of your other novels, come from learning some things. And I might just mention for a minute, as a professor of history and ethics at Southern Nazarene University, you've had a chance to interact with a number of people that are in the military or were more recently. But even looking back to our veterans in World War II, a lot of this just comes from getting to meet people, interviewing people, reading their material, getting their suggestions and ideas. And so if anybody wants to be a good writer, they just need to follow the footsteps that you've been following all these years.
Yes, Kirby, and as I'm sure you would agree with all the great books you've written, write what you know, write what God has put on your heart and given you a passion for, a conviction about. Don't try to figure out where's the market trending, or what is everyone else doing, let me do the same thing. Write what is on your heart, seek the Holy Spirit, and that's where the power and the passion is best going to come from your writing.
I might just mention we have a link to your website, and it is johnjdwyer.com. And I did not know until I watched one of your videos that grandfather was O'Dwyer, so that's where that came from. Never knew that before, even though I've known you for years. And there's some videos we want you to watch because this will help fill in the gaps a little bit. And there's some where you had a news organization do an interview with you, and then another one where you just sat in front of a camera and explaining that. But what we need to do is probably get into this new book, Mustang. But before we do, let's mention that your previous book, which was a Medallion Award winner called Shortgrass, kind of is almost like a prequel, isn't it?
It really is, Kirby. And you're a baby boomer, I think, and you'll remember that growing up, World War II was the great unseen presence, right? I mean, we weren't part of it. We didn't see it. It was always talked about, all the movies, all the dads and uncles and everybody. It was this revered family friend that was never quite made it there for dinner, but was always talked about and thought about. So really being raised in a home where, as I think I had a father that was very active in the Pacific Theater in World War II in the Army, but died at a very young age, and then raised by a mother who taught us to love history, to love America, to love its heroes, its patriots. I was just raised, I didn't have much chance. I was inundated with it, with a love of history from the start.
Well, and again, that earlier story takes you kind of to the Dust Bowl and some of that, and helps you understand kind of the formative years of what came to be known as the greatest generation. And the story you tell about your father is my father's story as well, because my father was kind of having trouble seeing out of one eye, and one time when they put up an eye chart, he couldn't even see the E on the eye chart, and he had to figure out a way to eventually figure out a way to fake that and actually get in to serve in the Air Force. Your father had to do essentially the same thing, didn't he?
Yeah, we kind of we grew up with our own Captain Americas, right? People have seen that film, the original film, when the guy just kept trying over and over again. What a concept in this day and time. These guys thought it was so important they could not stand to sit by while other people went and defended their country for them. So even when they had physical infirmities that should have kept them out, they were not to be denied.
Well, we both had fathers that were 4F, but they both found their way into the military by hook or crook. Let's come back and talk about Mustang, and I'm going to take you back to some halftime events at a Boomer Sooner event, that is University of Oklahoma, and that's kind of the origin of this book. So we're going to talk about this, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. But also we want to talk about such things as PTSD, or what used to be shell shock, and some of the things that affected even those in the military today. So we'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John J. Dwyer in studio with us today. We have a link to his website. Let me just mention that you can order the book there. We also have a link to, of course, you can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all sorts of places, and I think that will be a great opportunity for you to get this, and I would certainly want you to pass it on to anybody that enjoys history, enjoys the military, and I hope that, if nothing else, as you go to his website, you're available to speak. I think speaking to veterans groups, to libraries, to historical societies, Chamber of Commerce, since you're in the Oklahoma area, I think anybody that's anywhere near kind of the middle part of the United States, you'd be glad to travel and go and speak to them, wouldn't you?
Love doing that, Kirby. And when I come, I don't just bring myself. I always bring, media, PowerPoint with pictures and color, and we show them what we're talking about. In fact, this Saturday, anybody in the Tulsa area, I'm going to be doing a couple of book signings at the 2 Barnes & Noble stores all day this Saturday in Tulsa, and we're going to have the Oklahoma Homeschool Stage Band, which if you close your eyes, you're going to think Glenn Miller has returned to earth. They're going to be in the house at both those Barnes & Nobles this Saturday in Tulsa.
Again, for our people in Oklahoma, I have really enjoyed your book, The Oklahomans, the story of Oklahoma and its people. And every time I run across somebody that's from Oklahoma, I grab that book again and say, you got to read this. You have never seen anything like that. You've done such a great job of giving people in the state of Oklahoma their history. But let's talk about the origin of this book. Then it goes back to Oklahoma. You're at halftime, University of Oklahoma. Everybody's milling around. They're going to get drinks and everything. And eventually the whole stadium gets silent because of what? Because this was the origin of this book, isn't it?
That's right, Kirby. And again, encouragement to my fellow writers out there, don't give up. Churchill would say never, never, never. and even more so as a writer. This was 1986, Kirby, what,
wow.
30-something years ago.
Yes.
I had not even the twinkling or the glimmer of an eye of a book being published at that point. I was knee-deep in seminary, Dallas Seminary, was back visiting my old alma mater, University of Oklahoma. My brother Paul and I we were sitting at halftime of the game. Don't even remember who the opponent was. And as you said, it was revelry and all. But by the end of this ceremony, you could have heard a pin drop among 80,000 people.
Wow.
And what they were doing was inducting, as a lifelong OU fan, I'd never heard of this guy. First consensus All-American ever at the University of Oklahoma, pro football star, Waddy Young. And they were cataloging his athletic exploits and then his legendary deeds in World War II as an aviator.
Yes.
And I'll never forget, at the end of it, my brother looked at me. Everybody was just sitting there stunned at this story. My brother said, well, that was a different generation.
Yes.
But that's what started 30-something years ago. Waddy Young is a major character in both Shortgrass and Mustang. He's not the main character. He's the best buddy of the protagonist, the fictional protagonist, Lance Roark. Yeah. They're both aviators and flyers in World War II.
We learned a little bit more about Lance, but again, just think about that. 33 years ago, that's a third of a century, the genesis of this book in some respects. And again, let's talk about this because these guys are flying these super fast planes, and they're going against the Luftwaffe. Yeah. And as I mentioned last week when we talked about the Battle of Midway, these guys that are coming in fighting the Japanese with these torpedo planes, almost every one of them are eliminated. I mean, there is one wave and most of them are eliminated. Another wave, most of them eliminated. The few that drop their torpedoes, every single one of those miss those aircraft carriers. The third wave comes in. A few more survive, but not many. And not one of those hit a aircraft carrier with a torpedo. Then on this fourth and final wave, then you have the dive bombers that hit three of the four, sink them. Eventually the fourth sinks as well, and it becomes one of the most significant naval battles in history. Yeah. But again, most of these individuals, most of these aviators died. They did not make it past Midway. By the way, most of those on those aircraft carriers are the ones that actually bombed Pearl Harbor. They didn't have a chance to celebrate the victory at Pearl Harbor for very long. But talk about these individuals because they are fighting the Luftwaffe against individuals that were so much more successful in terms of aviation than the Americans were. True?
Exactly, Kirby, and a shout out to Casey Cowan. He's the guy that was mad and crazy enough to decide to publish these books.
Yes.
Publisher of Ogma Creative Media, Tyree Press is the imprint for Shortgrass and Mustang. Several years ago, he came and spoke. Did I mention earlier the importance of being in a writers group, my fellow writers? The Oklahoma City Writers Group, and here was this publisher from Arkansas, and he said, first thing off the bat, he said, just want to make sure everyone knows we're not accepting unsolicited manuscripts. He goes, I don't want there to be any awkward situations. So he kind of got that out of the way, that they weren't taking manuscripts. Well, after the talk, I go up to him and we realize we have a common literary hero, Herman Wouk, The Winds of War, War and Remembrance.
Oh, sure.
And
yes.
Kirby, I was literally had goosebumps a moment ago when you were telling that story about the torpedo bombers at Midway. And, of course, Midway was the turning point in World War II.
Yes,
it gets overlooked, but that we were getting our what's kicked until that point. That turned it all the way around. Well, when I read Herman Wouk's depiction of the American patriots and what the price that it took to win at the Battle of Midway, that is what really, I think, engendered in me, and that was even longer ago than 1986, the idea and the passion to tell a World War II story at some point. So turns out Casey Cowan, the publisher, and I, we have a common literary hero, Herman Wouk, and we reference War and Remembrance that took place in, and that led to a publishing contract with, an inspiration, as you kind of alluded to with Mustang. You've got these American aviators that are good old boys off the farm, from the football field, from the shop. Most of them were people of humble means at that point, early 1940s, and they were going against the greatest fighting force in history. I mean, we forget it took 6 years for Russia and all of its satellite nations, all the European nations, the British Empire, the United States, and most of the Western Hemisphere to beat the one country, the Germans. These guys, their aces, aviation aces, had 250, 300 kills per man. Mm-hmm. So we had guys that were going in that had a couple hundred hours in the air ever. Yeah. That's and so what we do with Mustang, Kerby, for your listeners out there, is if you want to get in the cockpit and see what it really was like in the European Air War, the greatest aerial war in history, and the cost and sacrifice it actually took for America to clear the skies so that there could even be a D-Day, which we celebrated last week, so our men would not be massacred on the beaches. It was a precious price that it cost and it took for us to win that battle in the skies. And it hasn't really been told very many times before in the raw way that we've done it. So I think fasten your seatbelt when you climb in the cockpit with Lance and Waddy and the boys, because it's a turbulent ride.
Let's talk about it for just a minute, because this is historical. It's historical fiction, so people might say, I'm not familiar with that, although I think you've done a good job of explaining that in the past, and we've talked about Stonewall, and we've talked about Lee and others. So there are historical events in here, but at the same time, you pull together some of the other stories so that you give us a fictional story about one individual, but by following him through that, you have a pretty good idea of what it must have been like to be a World War II ace.
That's right, Kerby. Whether it's my editors, my agent, or my wife, Grace, they're always saying, okay, stop preaching. Don't put too much history in there. They know that it's good to have it, but in a historical drama, a novel, you don't want to exposit too heavily. So, but what I've done is I've found ways to weave it into the narrative. So you're actually, as you go through Mustang and Shortgrass before that, the prequel, you're actually tracking in the background. You're hearing what's going on elsewhere in the world during World War II. And I might add that historical fiction, as you say, you weave in real characters, real events with a fictional protagonist in this case. But also, this is written, as all my works are, from a providential Christian worldview. That means there's some rough edges. It's a rough time. It's a rough war. But it's written in a way where you're not going to be embarrassed if you sit down to read it as a family. I don't know if I'd have a 6-year-old listen in necessarily, but certainly with your children a few years older than that, where you're not going to be embarrassed with the language and things like that. And that takes some doing, as you know, in this day and time when people want to read a rock'em sock'em adventure, war epic. Sometimes they're looking for elements that, as a Christian, I'm not willing to put in there. But it's real, and ultimately it's redemptive. And I think when you read Mustang, there's going to be a while there you're going to think, well, how's this thing possibly going to turn out redemptive? Kind of like our lives, right?
Yeah. Well, again, I just hope that sometime somebody thinks the idea of making it into a film. Remember the Pearl Harbor film and some of those? Just be a great opportunity. But if nothing else, you also just mentioned you have editors. You said before that if you didn't have editors, this thing would be a lot longer. It's 300 pages, just barely. And so as a result, it's quite readable and quite interesting. And if you have young people that are interested in the military, interested in history, you got to get them a copy of this book. And of course, when we come back, we're going to get into some other aspects of that, because as a professor, you've learned that some of the issues in the film are shown up with our military right now. So we'll take a break and be back right after this.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. John J. Dwyer in studio with us. We're talking about his book, Mustang. And just before we get back to the book, let's talk about your website. If people click on the button there at Point of View and scroll down, that will take them to your website. And as they go there, first of all, of course, they can order the book there. They can probably find it in the local bookstore and other places. But you also have media, your bio, and a place to connect, because if people were interested in maybe having you come and speak, or if they would like to have you do a book signing or speak to a historical society, that's all available too, isn't it?
Absolutely, Kerby. It's just a click away. You go to johnjdwyer.com and you can email me. And I've gotten to where I spend a couple hours a day. You probably do this too, just corresponding with readers and folks that follow what you do and encouraging them. So love to hear from folks and interact, especially if you have an interest in World War II, aviation, the veterans, that sort of thing that Mustang has to do with.
One other topic I want to put on the table before I start taking some phone calls is this idea in the book of shell shock. Today we call it PTSD. Now, as you well know, we've done some programs on PTSD on the military. My commentary last Friday was about the incredibly high suicide rate among farmers, which has caught the CDC off guard, so you can read that. I got two commentaries coming up next week, Monday and Tuesday, dealing with the issue of suicide. It's just something that surfaces more and more, these deaths of despair, the opioid overdoses, suicide, and the rest. Back in World War I and II, we didn't know as much. We called it trench warfare, and in World War I, we talked about it later, shell shock. We now give it the title PTSD. But you've had people that have been in the military read your book that say, well, John, you must have been in the military. And you're going, no, I've not been in the military. But that comes from the teaching that you've done at SNU with some of these military veterans that have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, right?
That's right, Kerby. Southern Nazarene University in Oklahoma City, where I've taught since 2006, was one of only 13 universities in America that a few years ago the U.S. Department of Education gave grants to establish programs for veteran student success.
Wow.
What that means is, and you'll see this on our website, we have a TV segment and other things.
I watched that, yes.
Yeah, it's remarkable. There's a building, and you know, classes I teach at SNU, some of them, 2/3 to 3/4 of some of those classes have been veterans. And we're talking people that have been deployed, Iraq, Afghanistan, special ops, some of them multiple deployments over multiple years. So as you said, I've had a couple of military folks, ex-pilots, that have said, you know, how did you make this seem so real in Mustang when you're not a veteran yourself? And it took me a minute before I realized it's my students, Kerby, over the last 15 years, not just in the classroom, but building relationships like I love to do at a Christian university like SNU. You go to coffee with them, they hang around after class. And I mean, I can't even begin to tell you the stories I've heard from honorable men and some women that have lost their families, that got into situations over there where they where there were killings of civilians that were accidental, that they never intended to be a part of, and they had to come back and live with that. Right. One man, a highly decorated Marine sergeant, was over there multiple tours. He told me after the last night of class, he said, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I said, what do you mean? He said, I got all my guys back home safe. I brought my whole squad back, platoon safe. And then last night I found out the fourth one, he was wrapping Christmas presents. He hollered at his wife from the other room, said, any more packages to wrap? She said, no, that's it, honey. He goes, okay. And he went in the bedroom and killed himself. He said, that's my fourth guy I've lost. And that's how they say it. And you vets out there that have commanded soldiers, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. That's your guy. And when a man takes his life, you feel like you've lost him. And so, you know, how do you process that? And some of these pages in Mustang, I feel like wrote themselves. And I have to tell you, I was weeping as I wrote some of these scenes.
I believe it, yeah. And again, this whole idea of PTSD, we now have a name for it, but it's been around for some time. We saw that in the Civil War. We saw it especially in World War I. World War II, again, how many times have we had stories, even over the last couple of weeks, because of leading up to D-Day and then after D-Day, people saying, you know, I asked my grandfather what happened in World War II, and they just never said anything. Or sometimes they'd say, I'll tell you someday. And just before they die, some of them tell these incredible stories, which you tell in this book, about what it was like to be in combat, constantly thinking that this is your last day on Earth. And if nothing else, you just write it in such a powerful way that this would be a great encouragement maybe for others to realize, I'm not alone. I went through this in Iraq or in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, wherever I might have served. And this is something that people went through in the European theater, in the Pacific theater, but we didn't know how to deal with it back then, and a lot of them simply dealt with it by not talking about it and just stuffing it down and going out there and trying to make a better world for their kids and their grandkids.
Well, that's right, Kerby, and as you and I were talking earlier, the folks listening to this show, are whether you're a veteran or not, you're a participant, and we need to realize that we have veterans around us. When we go to church with them, when we work with them, we have their family members. Maybe it's a wife and the kids come to church, and the dad who's been deployed multiple times, you never see him. We need to realize that if these guys have been deployed, if they've seen combat, they've got internal scars. That's one thing that was a shock to me, Kerby, after teaching these guys for 15 years. I used to think, well, PTSD, some guys come back with that, and it finally hit me. All guys come back with it. If they've been in action, that they have all been touched by it. So I would just encourage our listeners, think about somebody that's a veteran, that's a family member of a veteran, and just reach out to them. It's not like they're a charity case or anything. These are brave men and women, but reach out and be a listening ear, because sometimes their bond is so tight because they're the only ones, the veterans, that can relate to what each other's been through. So we that are non-veterans, we have an opportunity as Christians to step up, to reach out, to be a sounding board sometimes, because a lot of them bring back stories that they haven't totally processed yet.
Yes. Yes. Well, again, we'd love to know what you are doing as an individual, as your church, to reach out to the veterans. And so if you'd like to join us, that number, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Oklahoma. Carol, I appreciate you giving us a call today. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, thank you, Kerby. I just want to say I've followed both of y'all for years. We used to live in Texas, and I used to get the Heritage, and then followed you on the radio all these years, and just really appreciate both of your hearts for ministry and for spreading the good word.
Well, thank you.
I had a question. My dad was in World War II, never talks about it, not something he really ever brings up. I was wanting to get him the Mustang book, but didn't know if I heard you mention Shortgrass was a prequel. Does he need to read Shortgrass before Mustang?
Oh, good question. Shortgrass is the prequel to Mustang, but you do not have to have read that book. In fact, the publisher, the editors, we worked real hard so that if you pick up Mustang and you never even heard of Shortgrass, Mustang's a standalone novel. In fact, what we're finding a lot of people are doing is they're reading Mustang, and then they're going back and reading Shortgrass after that because they want to get to know Lance and Waddy and these guys better. So, yeah,
okay.
you can read Shortgrass and Mustang in either order that you want, or just read one of them. You don't have to have read Shortgrass to read Mustang.
Okay, great. And do you know if they're available in the audiobook? Because he doesn't like to read small print very much.
Within 60 days, the publisher just told me that last week. Shortgrass already is you can get that on Audible. I think it's the big one. So Shortgrass, and I might say that Audible version of Shortgrass, I've never heard a better job done. This guy, whoever did it, he actually learned the songs these people had, their Army songs, the alma mater songs at OU and these colleges, the sorority songs. And this guy, when there's lyrics to a song, he sings the melody to it. So Shortgrass is available on Audible, and Mustang will be in a few weeks.
Might just mention,
okay,
too,
great.
Yeah, go, Carol, thank you. I might just mention real quickly before we go to a break that if you click on the button there for Mustang, and then down below it has Shortgrass, if you click there, then it has the audiobook, the paperback, and the Kindle, and all of those. So, yeah, it's a full service. Plus, you're one on Oklahoma. I would just have to say, if somebody is living in the state of Oklahoma, they would appreciate that. The War Between the States, and of course, then some of your earlier books as well. So all of that is available, and we have a link to the website, johnjdwyer.com. There's a place where you can see some of the video interviews that were done by news outfits, as well as when you speak in front of the camera and give some of the stories there. So there's audio, video, articles, and the rest. And then there's a contact section. And I would just encourage some of you that maybe have a historical society that you're a part of, or maybe you even have a writers group. We got to get you to this Christian Writers Group maybe next year and have you hold up some of your books, sell some books, and tell some people how you write these, because we need to encourage the next generation to be good writers. So again, those are all resources available at our website, pointofview.net, or you can simply just go to johnjdwyer.com and find it there as well. We come back, since I'm talking to a history professor, let's talk about the value of history for just a minute here. Some of your students might say, why do I need to study history? I think we just proved it, but we'll come back and explain that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I'll take another phone call real quickly. Won't have a lot of time, but 1-800-351-1212. John J. Dwyer in studio with us talking about Mustang. But before I take another call or two, let's talk about history. You're a professor of history. We have a number of listeners that maybe have been teachers. Maybe they're even social studies teachers. They're listening right now. They're students listening. Let's talk about the value of history, first of all, and the fact that you're thinking about, especially with your next edition, the second edition on the Oklahomans coming out, you're talking about doing some kind of documentary. But how do we get history in the minds and the hearts of young people today? Have you thought about that?
You know, it's fascinating. Jesus went where the people were. He spoke to them in parables and all manner of other ways. Sometimes we wonder, why did he do that? Well, he did it in a way that would reach them where they were, at the well, in the field, in the temple, wherever. So I would say to my fellow teachers, and also some of you who may need to be our fellow teachers that aren't yet, do you have a passion for this sort of stuff? Because first and foremost, that's what's most important. Young people need to see that we older folks have a passion for what we're up there in front of the class talking about.
True.
And when you hear about, oh, that history course, in fact, history's boring, well, come to one of my classes, and I challenge you to be bored, because if you have a passion and a conviction for it, and that's what young people are looking for, things to be excited about. They're looking for things to have passion for. So I would say put it in a form, tell stories, give them individuals, not facts and figures as much as people of all colors, men, women of different times, that they can get fascinated in and want to emulate in their own lives.
Well, and again, one of the gifts that you have is you're a real good storyteller, and that is a gift you either have or you don't have, but you can cultivate some of that. And it's kind of interesting because I learned this years ago. When you read the Wall Street Journal, they don't start out with facts and figures. They tell you the story about a farmer who's going to go broke. They tell you about a banker that wasn't able to keep the bank running, and then uses that to tell the broader story. Well, there's a sense in which, if nothing else, we need to be able to do that as historians, and so that is certainly the case as well. So I would hope that a number of people that are listening today would recognize that all you have to do is personalize it, and even some of these fictional novels are a real good way to illustrate this, even if it isn't the actual person. It tells you the story of their lives, and reading a little bit of this very quickly, you see the eyes open up a little bit more in the part of young people, because they can then relate to a person, relate to a circumstance in a way that they can't relate to facts and figures and just an endless repetition of dates and numbers and things that mean nothing to them whatsoever.
Well, yes, and again, as Christians, we have an extra gear we can go to, that we can shift into, because you know, a lot of my colleagues in historiography that don't have an ultimate hope for this world or the next world, they come off as somewhat jaded, as somewhat negative at times. If you're a Christian, you don't have to sugarcoat that, wow, this is a fallen world. We're all tainted by sin, and there's a lot of messy stuff in history. There's a lot of it in Mustang. But ultimately, there are principles, people, and a future that should fire us up and give us inspiration. And young people are looking for that. They want hope. They want people and ideas they can believe in. And as a Christian, standing in front of a group of people, you have those ideas and people you can pass on to them.
You know, one of the things we're going to be talking about, maybe even tomorrow, is that when you look at the World War II memorial, there is really nothing about God that's mentioned there. And yet, as Jerry Newcomb, who I think will be able to join us tomorrow or sometime in the future, has written about, there has been a real desire to do that. And anybody that listened last week when I read the prayer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know that Bill Federer, you know him pretty well, and others have documented that most presidents use the name God quite a bit, and yet you wouldn't even know that we were a God-fearing nation when you look at the World War II memorial. So I appreciate the fact that you have a book that reminds us that faith was really important for us to win the war in World War II.
Yes, sir. In fact, when you compare, you read Roosevelt's piece, and that was so beautiful that I put it on my Facebook page. I copycatted it from you, but there was two imperfect civilizations fighting against one another, and we did things in that war, as happens in all wars, that we wish hadn't happened.
True.
But no doubt there was one side. Adolf Hitler considered the Christian church and Jesus Christ his greatest enemy because it was the biggest danger to his idea that Christianity was for losers, that we are men, we're captains of our own salvation and destiny, whereas the humble American patriot and soldier, you've seen these pictures when they're getting ready to go in Midway and battle the Bulge, when the company chaplains are leading them in prayer. It was a far different group of people and cause that went to war on the Allied side.
So one more time, let's just mention that you have Shortgrass. Talk about that for just a minute, because even though you don't have to read it, we just heard that a minute ago, it's really helpful. And it gives me an insight, because a generation that grew up and affected by either directly or indirectly by the Great Depression became the greatest generation to go off and fight World War II.
Well, you're right, Kirby. And what's this greatest generation? Well, these are the people that not just won World War II, but they survived a Great Depression that was brought on them by people older than them, parents' generation and so forth. In much of our country, the Southern Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, other parts of other states, the Dust Bowl. And so that was a horrible catastrophe. So Shortgrass tells a story of a young American farm boy growing up in the midst of all that. Dust Bowl, Great Depression, war burgeoning in other parts of the world. And you see the behind the scenes of what that young generation was going through in the years leading up to. And I think that helped prepare them to shoulder up and step up as young people and take on the burden of World War II. And I might also add that kind of a bonus in Shortgrass is you get through some literary devices to see the behind the scenes, what was going on behind the curtain from an intrigue standpoint, a political standpoint, that led to America becoming involved in that war in the first place.
I might just mention that we were trying to get some people on, but just to run out of time here, that one of them was saying we really just need to be praying for our veterans. And that is certainly something we have done on the National Day of Prayer. We're coming up to the 4th of July. There's another opportunity to acknowledge veterans. Certainly Memorial Day is one of those days, and Veterans Day and those kinds of things. But we really just need to be thinking, as you pointed out, in our individual lives, in our associations, and especially in our churches, what we can do to affirm and to encourage and to support and come alongside some of these individuals that have fought for our freedom.
That's right, Kirby. And if there's an ultimate message of Mustang, it's that, as we've heard many times before, freedom's not free, but it goes beyond the price that was paid in World War II. And that's part of why I picked that war. We all agree that Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam, that there was great human damage done psychologically, even to the people that came back and survived. But we kind of always put World War II in a separate category because it was such in so many ways, almost a sacred crusade. But what I'm wanting people to know is that the long forgotten, the people that can't speak with their own voices now, and as you said a minute ago, most of them didn't talk about it themselves. I want us in a later generation to know that these guys paid a terrible price to deliver us the freedom and the opportunities and the affluence that we have now.
Well, again, we always like to certainly do what we can to thank those of you that have served in the military, and we'll never be able to thank you enough, but that's one of those reasons why I wanted to cover this. And just a week after the D-Day celebration, I thought it was still appropriate, and John, I knew you could come in studio, and so thanks for coming down from Oklahoma. Those of you in Oklahoma, you can go to his book signing, and if you would like to schedule him to come and speak, we have that link on our website. So, John, look forward to the next opportunity. I guess Volume 2 coming out on the Oklahomans, coming out, what, next year?
That's coming out next year if I live long enough to get it out, Kirby.
Well,
if it doesn't kill me first.
That's for the case. So, again, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And, again, if you'd like to know a little bit more, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.